Welcome to the Mind and Clip Theology podcast, hosted by Miriam Peace and Amy Patton, which come out of the Canadian Journal of Theology, Mental Health, and Disability.
We both live and work on lands that have been homes and remain homes to the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Neutral, and the Ojibwe Chippewa peoples and other peoples who have cared for the land.
We are grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land and are mindful of the need to repair broken covenants.
This podcast is an opportunity to model how faith communities can engage in theological and spiritual conversations around madness and cripness.
If you need a full transcript, you can find our videos on our YouTube channel.
We want to say before we begin that topics and conversations we are raising throughout our time together are often hard.
They are hard for Mad and Clip people ourselves, and hard for our families and loved ones.
So do what you need to do to take care of yourselves, your bodies, minds, and hearts.
And now, here is our episode. Welcome to this episode of the Mad and Clip Theology podcast. We're delighted to be joined here by two of our contributors from our fall issue, Noah McGregor, who's a familiar voice to the show, and Janet Hardy. So we are grateful for your presence today.
Thanks so much, Miriam. Yes, and we're so grateful that you joined us today. And we wanted to see if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to introduce yourselves. I'm sure our listeners will remember Laura, and she's been here quite a few times, and she's part of the Fab Four when we do our roundtable podcast. But Janet's a new voice here today, so we're so happy that you're here with us, Janet. So maybe, Janet, I'll ask you to introduce yourself first. So if you could just let us know your name and your pronouns and how you're connected to the journal, and then just give us a brief description of what you look like for our listeners. We would really appreciate that.
Okay, well, maybe I get to be an honorary Fab Five today then. That would,
Yes.
that would make me feel pretty nice on a chilly
Yes.
afternoon. So my name is Janet Hardy, and I am pronouns she, her. My connection to the journal is wonderful. Amy and Miriam asked if I would contribute one of the articles, one of the papers I had written as part of my studies at Emmanuel College, where I graduated May of last year, 2020, with a Master's of Pastoral Studies in the Christian stream. And I had written a paper for Pamela McCarroll's course called, the course is entitled Suffering and Hope. And in it, we studied a textbook that Pam had written about the end of hope. And a number of the chapters are kind of characterized as hope as fight, and hope as surrender, and hope as, kind of this various narratives around a hope journey. And I thought that I would contribute a couple of stories, one from my deep personal experience and one from kind of rather a distanced personal experience, and define a new chapter, not for Pam to publish, but simply just to add to the conversation around hope as community. So that's really the genesis of the article. And because it deals with the very difficult disease of we all know is ALS, which does bring profound consequence physically, as well as relationally and cognitively in some instances, kind of fit, I gather, with the way that your journal was navigating towards addressing some of these issues of where you find spiritual nourishment in the midst of whether or not that's a health crisis, which has a beginning and the end, such as ALS, or in some cases, obviously, our chronic, ongoing, difficult situations that other folks surround. So that's really where the background is. And in terms of where I can kind of continue post-graduation to connect myself into the community of ALS and different other communities dealing with whether that's mental or physical decline, it has been very difficult because I'm retired, and so I am now moved into the volunteer kind of community, and with the various ups and downs of lockdown with vulnerable populations in particular, it has been difficult to generate any momentum. So I do just like we're doing today, remote support of a couple of ALS families and remote support as I can for one of the senior care communities in Toronto, but I'm going to be able to be back in with them next week, not the ALS families yet, but into the senior care community. So that's really, I guess, where I would be in terms of life stage. And I also provide some pastoral care at my church community and do some spiritual guidance work, spiritual awakening study work at in my church community. So as I said, I did brush my hair, but usually it looks a little more like hat head. I'm constantly wearing a fuzzy jacket, which right today is kind of a cream colored with a little black trim around the throat, which I got from one of my daughters for Christmas. And I have jeans on, and the constant presence of a pair of fuzzy slippers seems to just round out the winter outfit for the day. So that's a little bit about me.
That sounds so comfortable, Janet. I was thinking before the podcast started, I was just out shoveling the driveway. So I have like Canadian like hood hair right now because I have my hood over my hair. So a lot of fluff and frizz. So thank you so much, Janet, and welcome to be the Fab Fifth today.
Excellent.
Yes. And Laura, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, thank you so much for including me. Once again, I'm always so happy to be part of these conversations. They're always so interesting and and just exciting. And I love all the connections and the people and the ideas that we've shared. It's just wonderful. So I'm Laura McGregor. I'm an associate professional faculty at Martin Luther University College in Waterloo, Ontario. It's a federated college with Wilfrid Laurier University. I wear a couple of hats there. I teach. I am the director of the Luther Center for Spirituality, Disability, and Care, and I'm also the coordinator of a continuing ed program that looks at disability and Christian ministry, basically. So lots of different hats. My pronouns are she, her. I'm connected. My connection is always sort of fun because I met Miriam when she was maybe 9 or 10. My son was actually only a baby and had been recently diagnosed with cerebral palsy. And mostly what I remember about Miriam at that age is she kicked my fanny at cards. And then I met Amy at a symposium several years later, like a few years ago. And then I guess we've just stayed connected in our interest in exploring disability theology, mental health, and caregiving. So it's just been a really wonderful organic connection that's been so enriching for me. And in terms of what I'm wearing, I am wearing a sort of cream neutral color turtleneck, mostly because it's really cold where I am right now. And I have COVID hair, but it's for the first time, I think in a very long time, not in a ponytail, which meant that someone on a Zoom call this morning struggled to recognize me. And I think that's probably about it. Excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I was thinking your beautiful hair and your sweater and your background, it reminds me of watercolors today. It's just such a beautiful sort of serene, calm background. So we love it.
Awesome. Well, we'll jump right into our first question for both of you. Janet's article describes hope that is found in community for families with members with ALS. And Laura's article describes a lack of hope, spiritual confusion, and an absent God for families with medically complex children. And so we wanted to pose a question about hope, and as is hope easy to identify, or was it a struggle to find in the stories and in the peoples you were engaging with? So I think we'll invite Janet to go first in this. Laura.
Thank you, Miriam. It had been a while since I had read my own article, and it gave me the privilege of reading Laura's article, kind of in short time frame, one against the other. So it was really interesting for me. And what I realized is that I had the privilege of distance from this family. Like, I mean, we were intimates, but I was not living day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute, immersed in the care of a person, a beloved person who was needing the level of care and had a prognosis that maybe, you're always kind of struggling with, where does this go next? So I do know that my narrative, for some people would seem slightly naive maybe, or slightly overly optimistic. I don't really know, but I feel as though, in contrast to Laura, to your situation, I had this distance that gave me a totally different lens from which to kind of process these ALS journeys, and to kind of, I got to be the witness, not necessarily the living, breathing, integrated, that person's life is dependent upon me kind of character in the middle of these different kind of situations we're exploring. So I do know that if I had written this article with my girlfriend as wife, as primary caregiver, I would have had a different paper to write, because her journey was that profound. And I know at the end of Peter's life, she was just gone, like she'd almost disappeared in the middle of her own life, because she had just given everything she had. So it would have been a different narrative. So I do want to say that my Hope as Community lens is of a particular nature, where not only are we a step removed from the day-to-day, but we also then have this support network of each other. Like, we have a circle around this situation where if any of us began to struggle, we could hold our hands outbound to find somebody to share our grief with, or to kind of problem solve, or whatever it was that was needed kind of at the moment. So I really did find that super interesting in reading my article after I had read Laura's. And so hope in the middle of all that, like, I think is a bit of a different existential question that maybe had a more straightforward, practical answer. than it would if I had been the center, at the very heart of the narrative, like Laura, you were. So hope was not hard to find. And in fact, it was this deeply enriching life experience for so many of us. But we were not the people who were kind of at the heart with really the overwhelming burden that was navigating every second of it all.
Thank you, Janet. That's interesting to know the differences from where we are located in relation to finding hope. Yeah. Laura, I invite you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like Janet, I read the two articles side by side for the first time last night. I had read Janet's article many months ago, I think, when the journal was first published, but not right alongside my own work. And so doing that was really helpful. And I'm looking forward to the conversation because I think there's a lot of overlap, and there was much about Janet's article that I found fascinating and with strong resonance to some of the work I'm really interested in. But to go back to the question about hope, I think my first thought when I read the question around, is it always this easy to find hope? And this idea that the families that I was connecting with were struggling with an absence of hope. My first thought was, I wasn't sure they were struggling with an absence of hope. They were struggling with a perceived absence of God. But what I found utterly fascinating is that even amid this journey of grief and spiritual confusion and perceived absence of God, there was enduring hope, that this hope that God was somewhere in the chaos, and the incredible optimism in some ways against all odds that led them to continue to look for God and to hope for God within this overwhelming sense of chaos. So that, I think, was one of the things that really struck me. And I think for these parents, the challenge was the paradox, this paradox of living with this utter confusion, spiritual confusion, spiritual loss, existential crisis, alongside this paradoxical hope, this tension of living with this confusion and loss, with this hope that God was there, and there was joy amid this chaos at times. It was just a very, I think for many of the parents, it was a very complicated and very conflicted experience and story. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. The presence of hope in that paradox. Thank you.
So Janet, I'm going to ask you a question next about your work. You mentioned before that you have your transition to be out, quote unquote, in the field now providing care. So we were wondering, how have you found your transition from the classroom to the field? And has your idea of hope changed since you've begun working with families and other individuals?
Well, I think I call, like, I don't think I have a kind of this universal understanding of hope anymore. I think I just find that hope is kind of just buried in the authentic experience that each of these families have. And I find that hope comes, I guess I find hope comes and goes, that there are days when I can lean into suffering alongside somebody else, and I can feel their strength. I can feel a strong day. I can feel a more hopeful day. Maybe there was a burden relieved around a physical situation, or maybe a check came in the mail, or maybe whatever it was, a phone call was made that just seemed to nourish somebody, and this sense, there was this sense of bit of momentum. And then there would be other days where you just felt that momentum had been reshifted in a different direction. There had been another crisis to manage. And I found that hope is so correlated with physical capacity, that I think I've learned that as well, that as the physicality of a declining progressive disease begins to take its toll, not only on the patient, but the caregiving family, that this notion of hope just kind of has to shift. It keeps moving and morphing in different ways. And I think in my article, I kind of talked about it moves alongside whatever the grief stage is. So this kind of stage of early diagnosis, and grief just looks like this kind of loss of dreaming, this loss of a sense of where the future is. And so the hope questions and the hope for the feelings of hope just kind of shift into whatever the question or the issue of they find themselves kind of bumping up against. And then it moves to this stage of every couple of days, there's just a shift in the well-being, physical, emotional well-being of their loved one. And so there are good days and there are bad days, and you can just feel the momentum. It's almost like hope is momentum, and then hope is deflation, move and morph through this fairly extended period of time. And then actually they're settling into this like a bit of just a calmer, more peaceful stage, as it becomes quite clear the end is coming, and their loved one doesn't speak to them so much anymore. The grief associated with that stage of where you find hope is you almost begin to shift as the panic to breathe and the panic to eat and the frustration you see in your loved one as they attempt to try and just communicate that, please turn off that TV show because actually you had me watch that yesterday. When you see that, kind of those sorts of interactions, it's almost like there is kind of this acceptance hope. To some extent, hope moves into a phase where you have no choice but to somehow be just calm and patient because the end is coming. And kind of what do you want to leave behind? What kind of hope do you want to leave with the person who is there as your loved one, right? You want to leave this sense of they had deep meaning, and you were just a great presence in their lives. And so I think you approach kind of hope a little bit differently. So the momentum of that hope is kind of gentler, and there's no hope for anything but a peaceful end. It doesn't have an unknown termination. The termination is not known. You don't know the day, but you kind of almost know the month. And then you fall off the cliff. Then your loved one dies and you fall off the cliff. And then hope looks like redefining your whole life, because all that gave you to some degree some stability, meaning and purpose, no matter how difficult that was, is gone. And of course, your dear loved one is gone. And until the last breath, they're still beside you. So then hope has to move into almost like this regenerative definition of hope. It needs to have a new parcel to live in. And I guess that's kind of what I would say. It's such a journey, and it really depends on what stage of life or death the loved one is in. And it's so correlated with the stages of grief. It's kind of that hope and suffering paradox, right? Our tension, that it just always constantly reminds me that all we can be is a presence that recognizes and is aware of as best we can of exactly where everybody else is at, not you, but where everyone else is at. And then your definition of faith, or what you can bring to the equation, or faith and hope, what you can bring to the equation just has to be in response to that kind of awareness and that quiet presence that you need just to bring to the situation until you can move to some form of comfort or action or support or whatever the case would be.
Thank you, Jan. And I was wondering, as you were talking, how did you feel going back to your paper? Did it feel like your research was like connects well to your experience now that you're in the field, or does it feel like, would you like to have rewritten sections?
Yeah, I've always been accused all my life of being too perky. And so I would say, I just read that and I thought, oh my heavens, there she is, Miss Rosie, rose-colored glasses. I probably would have been, I tried my best in the visuals in that article to represent these different stages that I felt like we journeyed alongside. But because I was just dealing with a very personal situation, and then the one that we dealt with as a community from a bit more afar, I didn't really necessarily explore how unique everybody's journey was. Like there wasn't a sense of this. How do you translate that to somebody's journey that was actually not like that at all? Right? Like I will simply state that our social location of this group is affluent and educated, and all of the things that we could bring to the party were as a result to some degree of some of our privilege, and having this beautiful core group of people who just stayed connected around a single cause. We had good moment, like we just had a good hold, a good center. And these were beloved friends. These were beloved, like some of our favorite people. So they were such a magnet for our support. I also will say that from a social location perspective, I grew up in a rural farm community where this is what people at church did. So to the other article, to Jeff's situation, I find that now that I'm in Toronto, in an urban environment, in an affluent congregation, that the culture is so totally different. So I recognize that once again, this concept of being in this rural, small parish situation this is how people live their faith. We were theology light, embodied big. And so like I can, you just move to food, and you move to who needs to go where and what you need to have picked up. You move into those directions quite quickly and practically. And in some ways, sometimes that's all you can do. So now that I've transitioned out of theology school with some more conceptual frames, I feel sometimes I have to really push myself back into embodiment, like to really be an embodied spiritual care practitioner, and not simply a practicing kind of arm's length conceptual, just talk about it, be a passive presence. So I'm kind of, and COVID hasn't helped because it's very hard to be an active presence. So, but as we move forward from here, it's going to be one of my tensions, is how do I combine both pieces of that? How do I take my life narrative as this embodied faith practitioner alongside this newfound kind of role as a bit more of a cerebral spiritual care practitioner?
Thank you, Jen. And it's so important to name and recognize our social location and how that shape our embodiment in our relationship with each other. So thank you.
Very welcome.
Let's move on to Laura. One category Amy and I were really drawn into was when you name parents as having a frustrated faith. This paradox of God feeling absent while eager for God, like you talk about in your introduction. So we wondered if you could talk a bit more about the paradox and what is the role of others alongside people with frustrated faith?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I used the term frustrated faith to describe the tension that the parents in my study were living with all the time. So just to orient readers who may not have read the article, I spent time listening to the stories of a small group, 9 parents in southwestern Ontario who were raising children who met the definition of medical fragility by their local home care team. So for those who may not be familiar with the term medically fragile people, I was looking specifically at children, but people are people whose healthcare status can change quickly with little warning and can deteriorate rapidly with potentially life-threatening consequences. So one of the difficulties of parents raising these children is that it is entirely possible your child can live for a very long time with significant health challenges. It is also entirely possible that tomorrow you could be calling 911 and your child doesn't come home from that hospital trip. Both of those are realistic in the lives of parents raising these children. One article which I cite is an article that compares the parenting of these children to living with a time bomb. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if it's going to sit quietly in your living room forever, or if something will happen and there will be significant consequences or loss of life. And so these parents live with the ubiquitous presence of the unknown. And the knowledge that they are responsible for trying to keep their children as healthy as possible for as long as possible. So this is a really difficult journey for parents. And the parents are doing significant levels of care that Janet describes in her article. So these are very complex children who are usually receiving complex level nursing level care. So they have feeding tubes. One family had a defibrillator in the home. These parents function as 24-hour nurses, and they do this for a very long period of time with no real understood endpoint. Perhaps the way ALS has a better understood endpoint. So there's this sense of ongoing, overwhelming responsibilities with no end in sight. And so a chronicity and a chaos and an uncertainty to this experience. And so in this story, the parents described this overpowering love of their children. It's the love for their children. This is why they were making these often massive sacrifices, was simply because they adored their children. They loved their children and they were deeply committed to their flourishing. However, their lives were also extremely overwhelming, and they lived with numerous losses, both in terms of parenting their children, but also their own personal stories. They gave up jobs, they lost friends, they couldn't leave the house. We had one parent tell a story of going to the washroom and coming out and finding her child had stopped breathing. So even something as simple as going to the bathroom was overwhelmingly challenging. But in this story, they loved their children and they found joy in their children, and they found joy in the moments of parenting their children, the silly moments parents experience, stories and bubbles and music and cartoons. And in those moments, there was a great sense of joy, but this was always balanced with this overwhelming sense of responsibility, fear, tension, and chaos. And so navigating this and looking for God became overwhelmingly challenging. And it became more challenging when they went to church and people would offer these overly optimistic and what I call tidy theologies, where God was explained. So God is, you are going to learn much with this journey. Yeah, that's true, but it also is very difficult. So these sorts of tidy theodicies that the parents were on the receiving end were often very challenging, and it left them uncertain where God was. Their community was so certain where God was often telling them, God won't give you more than you can handle. Here is God. Their community would locate God for them. The problem was they couldn't locate God. And so they became overwhelmed. And this frustrated faith of, you know where God is, but I don't know where God is, was often existentially challenging. But I think, again, what was amazing is that they lived in hope of finding God, and they often continued to search for God within this very complicated, isolating, chaotic, disorienting story and journey of faith. These parents continued to live in hope that God was in the story, and they often looked. And what was overwhelmingly difficult, and what led me to sort of label it as frustrated faith, was that they looked for God and often couldn't find God. There was this deep sense of loss and absence, and it was exacerbated by a community that so confidently located God for them. So in terms of responding to it, I think much of what Janet talks about in her article about presence and about support and about listening, about willingness to enter chaos, willingness to offer practical support, all of those things that she talks about in her community as hope, I think are really relevant. And the parents would have absolutely loved this kind of support from their faith communities. They didn't get it. And I think that's the problem. And I think that's a conversation that I'm really interested in having with Janet, is why was one community so willing to respond to a particular story, and these parents found that their faith communities not only failed to respond, but exacerbated their sense of isolation, and at times offered these explanations for God that even felt judgmental. You know, you are paying for a sin, perhaps, which parents were on the receiving end of. And so I think there's a really fascinating conversation there. So that's sort of a long answer, I think, to the question of sort of what was going on and what I would suggest. Well, I would suggest communities be willing to journey with these families, knowing that this is often a long and difficult journey with an uncertain ending. So it is very different than perhaps the ALS story.
Thanks so much, Laura. And I wonder, you provided the most perfect segue there between questions. I wonder if you would like to talk together and explore your question about why do some faith communities seem to be able to provide the care that's needed, and some really drop the ball when they should be able to hold it. So I wonder if you want to start there. Usually at this point in the podcast, we ask our guests to talk to each other about each other's work. So, all right, what do you think, Janet, about what Laura
you know, I feel like I want to apologize on behalf of all church-going people to Laura and her community. There's two things that come to mind for me. One is this idea of embodied faith versus kind of this sense of theological certainty. And so when you talk about God, I just wrote down, like, it's like, to me, there is no the God. Like, the God means that there is some sort of narrative or some sort of image that is certain, that is, maybe that's the white guy in the sky on the cloud, and they know all, and they see all, and they decide all. And so that really, to me, certain narrow image of not a her, him, not a young, an old, not a, not an up and down. It limits people. It limits people's capacity to love. And it limits people's capacity to think on their think for themselves. And so I do not belong to a congregation, and I never have in my whole life belonged. I mean, I'm a United Church person. We're always just spiritually rather fluid and seeking, right? There was nobody to tell you this must be the definition of yours. Now, maybe when we were little kids in Sunday school, and I'm 65, so that was a long time ago, we did have the pictures on the wall, but I haven't seen those for quite a long time. So I often find when I heard you talk about, like, they've lost God, or I just wonder what the reference point for God is for them, such that it seems rather static or certain, and then the chaos gets thrown. And when that certain God disappears in the middle of it all, you're left hanging without kind of a seeking frame of reference, or the, I don't know if it's ability or the capacity to kind of open your mind around, well, maybe that Sunday school version of my God was not so hot in my world at present. So I think that's one of the reasons I ended up, after a business career, back in Emmanuel, because I just felt as though I had no framework for my own interpretation of what I thought of as the divine presence. I'm not even quite sure I use the God word so much anymore, because after studying many faiths, obviously there is no one word. I mean, there is our word if you want to have an our word, but so that's kind of this kind of reference point of this God image, and how it could easily be lost if you're in a congregation where people have this very certain static image of God. So that was one thought that came to my mind. It's kind of like, well, what's your God? What does your God feel like? What's the presence of your God feel like? Not necessarily the God. So that was one thing. And then I just also feel as though you're describing the tension I feel all the time between the institutionalized church and our faith at heart. And I actually think the simpler, you can know every word of every scripture and not live it. I'd rather live a few simple, beautiful passages than be able to quote every passage in the Bible and think I'm smarter than your average Christian. So I tied up in the crisis for religious institutions right now is this issue of certainty, because it leaves no room for people to be faithful in a way that makes sense in their current context, society, and so on. So I feel the tension of this question I always have is, could the church stop being an institution? And could it simply be a community of faith journeyers who are always a work in progress? If we could get there, I think we'd have a lot more companions along the journey as we have now.
Yeah, so sorry, can I jump in now?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Not
Thanks,
sure.
Laura.
Okay. Yeah, so it's interesting. I'm looking at my notes on sort of a page in terms of this question, and I have a lot. And it didn't even sort of touch on what Janet just noted, and but I agree wholeheartedly. So a couple of things in terms of this whole idea of who and where and what is God for these families. And I think I agree with you wholeheartedly, is that many of these families were navigating a spiritual journey that involved an institutional church. And so God had this very particular definition. And they were actively struggling with that particular understanding of God, in part because of, not in part, because of a great deal of their story with their child. I think, though, this idea of God as community and God as communal support and God and faith expressed in community was also a concern, because I think they also felt that they didn't get that. That this idea of people journeying with them and being the hands and feet of God in very practical ways got lost. And I think there are lots of reasons why it got lost. These stories they told are so threatening, similar to the stories of living with ALS. They are deeply frightening, terrifying stories. And these families were, they would be constant reminders when coming to church of this amazing level of chaos that involved children. And I think there's something that even heightens it when there's children involved. It really challenges a sense of a good and loving God when children are suffering. And so that's one piece. I think the other thing is that these parents, and as we saw with this frustrated faith and this constant yearning for God, they hadn't forgotten God. They were continuing to look for God, and they were developing their spiritual lives and their faith in ways that that moved away from the church. These people would all still identify as deeply spiritual, like these parents would identify as deeply spiritual people, and they were engaging a very rich and active faith life. It just no longer involved church.
Mm.
And what's really interesting is that right now I'm very privileged to be part of a study funded by the Louisville Institute that's basically moving the next step beyond this particular study I did several years ago, where we're talking to parents about what their spiritual care needs, what would they want, and what is going on in their particular spiritual story. And many of them talk about leaving church or about having much of their spiritual life being satisfied beyond this institutional understanding of God and church. And so I agree with you. There's something really, really important going on there. And that if we as a church community, as a faithful community of people, want to continue to support and care for one another, we need to be listening to these stories and hearing how they shift our understanding of the divine and what it means to live in community with one another and what it means to be the church for and to one another. So I think it opens up lots of really fascinating questions, and I'm so grateful that you raised them. There's so much I want to talk about with regard to the study. I'm aware of the time because I think, we need a second hour, because I found so much overlap between your paper and mine. And there was so much that I found resonated for me, both as a parent who cared for one of these children and as a researcher who is deeply connected to this community. But I think one of the things that I'm curious about is that there seemed to be this real difference to how communities responded to these, what I would call extreme caregiving situations. And I think we both were describing what Lisa Freitag describes as extreme caregiving. And one of the things I wondered, what are the differences, that we're dealing with children? Is it because and the words I used were time, predictability, and choice in my notes, that the care community in the ALS community, this care group in the ALS community, first of all, there was a clear sense of a defined timeline. You weren't committing to decades potentially of ongoing extreme care. There was a predictability. One better understood the illness narrative in a way that a story with a medically fragile child one doesn't understand. But there's also the element of choice that, with the exception of the family caregivers, and I appreciated that you tease out family caregivers and caregivers by choice, the family caregivers are thrown into this in a way that they don't have a sense of choice. And so there's this overwhelming sense of loss and chaos that comes with that. Whereas these community caregivers have a choice and have therefore an ability to set boundaries on their ability to care. The other piece that I think might be interesting is that I look almost exclusively, with very rare exceptions, at mothers. And I think there's a narrative around expectations of martyrdom. Mothers in particular are expected to care with almost no limits. So I'm wondering, and I'm just aware that we don't have tons of time left, but I'm wondering if these are things that might help us understand why the story of how a community responded to extreme care might be different.
Mm-hmm. So, like, I have I like your delineation of communities of choice. So I'm going to say that so that intimate family connection we had as a community of choice, there's an integration that, like, some of us were more aware of than others. So I would have, I think, a predisposition, a better predisposition than some of my colleagues in this community to kind of be aware and to kind of be able to navigate what I could speak to the family about in terms of their needs at the moment. So I was not afraid of those kind of conversations. And I am a badgerer. I'm a badgerer of families who do not want to ask for help because they are stoics. And I sort of say, listen, like, we can't help you unless you just strip it all away and say, I am buried today. Could you come? I'm buried today. I can't buy a slice of bread. Because that's one of the only ways that kind of that we as a community of choice can navigate in a more intimate, responsive kind of manner. So I do think totally different communities for sure, but I think in the middle of all that, in a traditional rural church, we would have a minister or some sort of pastoral care leader who is the translator, that also pastors to this question of, please, just, we have a lineup of people who are prepared to do things for you. Just ask. So I think in navigating that, I would sort of say it's important, and maybe that's somebody like me who now has some spiritual care training, where we can act as kind of the bridge that kind of understands the spiritual well-being aspect, the psychological well-being aspect, but at the same time understand relational well-being, physical well-being, financial well-being, vocational well-being, all of those moving parts. We do have some of those models as pastoral care practitioners, whether that's in a faith community or just in a more secular setting. And, so you need a translation node, a node of translation that can then move out more broadly to define what can be done. And so, I think one of the things that the whole community was very aware of is taking those bricks off your shoulder, which is what bricks can we simply take off? What are the easy, small wins that this community of choice can make by taking the bricks off? So there's a brick about money, right? That we were able, as an affluent group with GoFundMe and these various different now technological support systems, to be able to help as we could. And one of the primary ways we help was in an integrated fashion by paying Peter's daughter, who was just graduated from university, seeking her way in the world, to be at home with him for a whole year. Paid her $17 an hour, and she was his primary care. And the minute she moved on from that, she moved to Ireland to be with her boyfriend on a Monday, and Peter died on a Tuesday. She was actually the 22-year-old glue that held much of their family together through all this time, and she was willing to do that. So I do think that there's just this sense of, if we had a little bit of an integrated model that would say to Laura and family, we want to help. We are a community, a faith community that does understand some sort of sense of embodied faith experience life. And we know we have these various dimensions. We have a pastoral care minister who's going to translate, like, let's just move into a community of choice that just has a sense of a knowledge as to how to help best. Because to your point, like, man, at the same time, we're all looking at our dear friend dying, going, oh, so by the grace of God, you kind of you do have these narratives that you sort of say to yourself, that we know are pretty typical ones, like the ones you alluded to in your article, which horrify me now that I've been through seminary, which is, you can only handle what God gives you. Well, I'm sure I heard my grandparents say that probably about 1,000 times, but we know more now than we did then, or some communities know more than we did then. So, I would argue that there are pathways through the right person in your faith community to maybe activate it, but you're in the middle of chaos. So how are you going to how are you going to be the person who manages that, right? That actually has to be an active aspect of their faith community life, their church life, so to speak.
Jenna, we were wondering if you had any questions for Laura that you wanted to ask her about her.
Well, I just actually wanted to know, in your article, your dear Matthew died in 2020 in the midst of a whole pile of other kinds of chaos. And, I don't know if it's been 2 years now or a year and a half now, or whatever the time frame is, but when you reread this article and you put 18 months or 20 months or whatever the time frame is between you and the article, what bubbles up for you, or what comes up for you that says, okay, I've had another 18 months to journey through this kind of spirit, these questions of my own faith and my own spirituality, or my own institutional church experience. And, have you come to any, I'm not going to say different perspectives, but have you evolved along some of the questions and the paradoxes you were exploring in your paper?
Wow. Okay. Yeah, maybe. So it will be 2 years in March, so next month. So we are coming up on the 2-year anniversary of Matthew's death, and Matthew's birthday was about a week ago, actually. We just celebrated his birthday. We now host an annual food drive, so that's how we celebrate his birthday. Yes and no. And I think one of the things I really liked about your article, and I think it was on the second page, where you talk about the stages of grief and you talk about the complexity of death, of the experience of death. And for me personally, reading your article now as a mother, not as a researcher, I actually found that very affirming. So one of the things that's very complicated, I think, for my story, and I think it applies to parents who are, well, people who care for medically complex people with intense caregiving needs, is that the death is both devastating and a relief. And so you name that. And I found that very affirming, because certainly that was my experience around Matthew's death. We were devastated, that goes without saying. But there was also this sense of relief, both because I don't think I understood or could describe the word I use now is claustrophobic sense of responsibility and caregiving demands that I lived with for 21 years. And to not have them became very noticeable. So this idea that now I could sleep through the night, you named that in your article. There was that sense of a bit of relief there. Also relief that Matthew was no longer suffering. And just to be clear, I am not conflating disability and suffering. I am emphasizing that he did suffer in an embodied way with significant chronic illness and pain, particularly probably in the last year of his life, that were linked to his disability, but it wasn't disability equals suffering. And I just want to be very, very clear about that. It was the illness, the chronic illness piece. So the fact that that there was some end and closure around that was helpful. And I appreciated that you named that in the earlier part of your article when you were discussing stages of grief associated with chronic illness in particular. In terms of my personal response and sort of have I come to any new conclusions, I almost want to say no.
Sure, you're allowed to say no.
Yeah, like I think partly because I think there's a sense that there's just this continued journey of making sense of this story I lived with Matthew that began 23 years ago. And so for me, I've been living it and trying to make sense of it for 23 years. So and part of it was we in some ways were prepared for Matthew's death from the moment of his birth. So this has been something that has been part of my story, part of my journey as Matthew's mother and as Matthew's primary caregiver for a very, very, very long time. So and I think part of it is I refuse to sort of engage in what I name as a quest narrative around this story and his death and his life. I refuse to paint it with a Disney paintbrush. It is a complicated, paradoxical, and at times awfully chaotic story. And I think that has to stand. Have there been moments of profound beauty and learning along the way? Absolutely. Do they compensate for the pain and loss? No, they don't. And I'm not going to sit here and say they do. So I think that's sort of a complicated but brutally honest answer.
Yeah.
but
I
that's
think
what I
I-
am great. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, but I think that's, yeah, that just kind of sounds authentic to me. Like that just sounds like, why wouldn't it? Like, I guess I wasn't trying to ask whether or not like you'd had some sort of epiphany and like all was better and your heart is healed and all that kind of good stuff. It was just, it was just a bit more, even like for my own personal pastoral ministry, like what could a faith community have done different, or what could, like, what, like, as you process and you think about the alienation so many of the families in your research felt from their institutionalized faith community, what less, like, in your experience, are there lessons for those of us who are desperately trying to keep our declining congregations open and relevant and meaningful, for another few years until, I don't know, secular society decides maybe there is no spot for us left in the world and we have to redefine ourselves in totally new ways, which may lean into exactly what you're trying to say,
Yeah, no, and I think I think one of the things I loved about your article is I think you hit on a lot of the ways that I think faith communities can respond, be present, listen, and you really, in many ways, echoed some of the stories the parents are seeing in my most recent research that has not been published yet because we're still in the data analysis stage, but you describe a lot of what they want. Honor the stories, enter the chaos, give practical support, offer funding, do fundraisers, drop off casseroles, offer childcare and play dates. Be my friend. That was a huge part of the research that emerged, or the findings that emerged from the most recent project. And the way you describe it, be my friend in a way that I can ask you for help, I can tell you when I'm drowning, that you'll come and have coffee with me, and be okay with the fact that I'm not okay. Like, really, and the parents are asking for this kind of support. Don't offer Bible verses. Yes, Bible verses might be helpful, and some parents are going to find that deeply meaningful, and I don't want to suggest that's not true, but please don't have it begin and end with a prayer.
We don't have to light the candle every time we get together. All that. Yeah.
Like, be my friend, drop off coffee, take my kids out for play dates, let me take a nap. Like, these things were really important, and faith communities that understood that this sort of the hands and feet of God and the church matter all week long, and in really informal and practical ways. And I think the other thing that parents really emphasized, and now I'm sort of starting to talk about the research I'm doing now, simply because it really grew out of this project and starts to answer some of those questions, is this idea that the safety of my child in this community. So knowing that my child is respected and loved and valued, and that the community is going to go to great lengths to include, welcome, accommodate, celebrate their gifts and leadership, that is as much a part of the parent's spiritual care as anything else. Knowing that their child is in a community where they are safe and loved is a significant part of the parents' the sort of the parents' needs and their spiritual care. So I think I would say to churches, well, if I could speak to churches, I would say throw everything you do out and start over again.
Yeah.
Like, think about who's not there, why they're not there, and what we're really being called to do, and then be open to radically new ways of doing it. And that might include hybrid worship, that might include worship that's not Sunday morning, that might include sermons that involve painting and yoga and music and drumming and are less intellectual. And that's what I want to see, is this growing into this church that embraces all but then cares for all.
Right. Is of the people, for the people. Yeah, which is kind of go back and read the New Testament again and really embody what was being purported. Thank you for your research too. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
And also, thank you for your journey, sharing your very authentic and powerful and sad journey, all of those things all at once.
What wonderful is we get insight into those new research, which is very exciting. And along with continuing our work, we wondered in just 1 minute each or 30 seconds each, where do you find energy to do this work? What keep you going doing this work?
Oh, just because it gives me such meaning and joy. And, sometimes it's just as simple as it feels like the right and good thing to do. That's all, nothing more complicated than that, nothing cerebral, nothing but kind of very just heart. That's where when I feel good, I feel warm in the middle of my chest. So I know what's right and good for me to do. So this kind of work brings that warmth, talking with people like you and hearing stories that are good, bad, and all often in between. It is the stuff of life. It's not just the stuff of people who aren't Instagram worthy. It's the stuff of life. And as I try and role model for my family, so much in this world is artificial and two-dimensional or one-dimensional on a screen. And really, you never know when you're going to be someplace different. And what you want are good people, good and right people to be with you along that way. So be a good person, just goodness.
Thank you, Janet and Laura.
Yeah, I appreciated this question. Thank you. And I'm actually going to circle us right back to where we started and say that my answer is hope. That the energy for this work comes from a deep sense of hope that we can do better, and hope for the future, that the church can do better, hope that I can do better, and that I can be part of the story of helping us all find a new way to live in community and support one another, particularly those of us who live complex and chaotic stories. And I think the last thing I would say, and where I draw energy, I draw some energy from my anger. Well, I'll be clear about that. But also from, so here's your answer also, Janet, from my son's life and legacy. There is a sense that I honor my son's life and my son's legacy and some of the chaos we lived by doing this work. And if I can in any way be part of helping us imagine a new way forward, there's a sense of calling in that. And so there's also a sense of deep meaning for me and for this very chaotic and complicated story I lived. And I continue to live.
Thank you both so much. Thank you for your wisdom and your putting your heart into this conversation. We really appreciate both of you. Amy, any last words?
Just to thank you both and say how much we appreciate your research and contributing to the journal, and just for being you. We're so happy to know both of you. So thank you.
Best wishes along your work and contribution. So you guys are doing fantastic as well. The Fab 4, Fab 2, plus whatever.
Thank you, Janet.
Thanks for including me again. I love being part of these conversations. Such a joy to meet you, Janet. And thank you for the incredible and tireless work that you two women are doing. It is so important, and I am so grateful.
Yeah, awesome. Well done.